The house wasn't just wood and nails to me, it was the last tangible piece of my mother. She had bought it with the settlement money after the accident that had eventually taken her, pouring every ounce of her remaining strength into making it a sanctuary. It was a single-story craftsman, with a sprawling oak tree in the front yard that she'd loved. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left it to me, and only me, in an ironclad will. It was my inheritance, my safe haven, my monument to her memory. At 23, owning a home outright was a privilege I never took for granted. My father, Robert, had remarried a year after Mom's death. Brenda was slick. She had a smile that never quite reached her eyes and a voice coated in artificial sweetness. Her daughter, Tiffany, was her shadow, a 24-year-old with a permanent air of entitlement. I tried to be civil, for my dad's sake. I hosted them for dinners, bought Tiffany a lavish baby shower gift when she announced her pregnancy, and bit my tongue when Brenda would walk through my house, making suggestions about renovations. "A nursery would be perfect in this room, don't you think?" she'd say, patting her daughter's swelling belly. I'd just smile weakly and change the subject. The call came on a Friday. "Clara, honey," Dad's voice was strained. "Brenda and I have a huge favor to ask. Our landlord is selling our rental, and we have to be out in 2 weeks. It's all so sudden." My stomach clenched. "Oh, Dad, that's terrible. What are you going to do?" "Well," he said, and I could hear Brenda whispering in the background. "We were thinking, just for a month or two, while we find a new place, could we stay with you? And with Tiffany's baby coming, it would be such a help." I hesitated. My 1,500 square foot house felt vast when I was alone, but with 3 other adults, one of them heavily pregnant, it would shrink to the size of a shoebox. But he was my dad. "Of course," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "But just for a couple of months, right?" "Absolutely, sweetie." "You're a lifesaver," he said, relief flooding his voice. "We'll start moving some boxes this weekend while you're on your work trip. Just to get a head start." The work trip was a 3-day conference in a neighboring state. I left them a spare key, feeling a knot of anxiety I couldn't shake. I called every night to check in. Dad was always cheerful. "Everything's great. We're making some good progress." On Sunday afternoon, I drove home, a sense of dread growing with every mile. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was that my mother's rose bushes by the porch were gone. In their place were 2 plastic pink flamingos. My heart began to pound. I walked to the front door, my key in hand. I inserted it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it. Nothing. It felt like the lock was filled with cement. Panic clawed at my throat. I knocked, hard. After a moment, the door opened a crack. It was Brenda. She wasn't smiling. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Brenda, what's going on?" "My key won't work." "That's because it's not your key anymore," she said, opening the door wider. My father and Tiffany were standing behind her in my foyer. My foyer, which now had a cheap love sign hanging where my mother's favorite landscape painting used to be. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where's my painting?" "We put it in the garage." "It was a bit dreary," Brenda said dismissively. "Robert, tell her." My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his shoes, shuffling his feet. "Clara, we had a family discussion. With the baby coming, Tiffany needs stability. She needs a home. This house is too big for a single girl like you." The world tilted. "A family discussion? I'm your family. This is my house. Mom left it to me. And we appreciate that," Brenda cut in, stepping in front of my father. "But families make sacrifices. Tiffany is pregnant. She and the baby are the priority now. It's just more practical this way. You're young, you can rent a small apartment. We've even packed a few of your bags. They're on the porch." I looked, and there they were. my suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes, sitting by the mangled remains of my mother's roses. Inside the house, I could see they had already moved in their furniture. My life, my mother's legacy, had been erased and replaced in just 3 days. "You changed the locks on my house?" I whispered, the betrayal so profound it physically hurt. Tiffany, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, rubbing her belly. "Don't be so selfish, Clara. Think of your little niece or nephew. Don't you want what's best for them? It's the right thing to do." I looked from her smug face to Brenda's triumphant sneer, to my father's pathetic, guilt-ridden silence. They hadn't just taken my home. They had taken my trust, my security, and desecrated my mother's memory. They thought because I was young and because they were family, I would just roll over and accept it. A cold, hard fury I had never felt before began to burn in my chest, cauterizing the wound of their betrayal. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was war. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice low and steady. I turned away from the door, from the plastic flamingos, from their smug faces. As I walked towards my car, I could hear Brenda's mocking laughter. Let her laugh. They had started this fight, but I would be the one to finish it. They thought they knew me. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Their worst nightmare wasn't a fantasy, it was me. The first 24 hours were a blur of shock and fury. I spent the night on the couch of my friend, Maya, who alternated between making me tea and suggesting increasingly creative, and likely illegal, ways to get my house back. "We could hire a guy, Clara. A big guy. Named Knuckles," she'd offered, dead serious. While tempting, I knew I had to be smarter. My mother hadn't raised a fool. She'd raised a fighter. On Monday morning, fueled by caffeine and rage, I walked into the most reputable law firm in the city. I was ushered into the office of a man named Arthur Vance, a lawyer in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately trusted. I laid out the story, my voice trembling at first, then growing stronger with each recounted detail of the betrayal. The stolen rose bushes, the smug look on Tiffany's face, my father's cowardice. When I finished, Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Well, Miss Thorne," he said, his tone grim. "Legally, this is straightforward. It's called an ejectment. You are the legal owner of the property. They are, for all intents and purposes, illegal squatters. We can have them removed." A wave of relief washed over me. "How long will it take?" "That's the tricky part," he cautioned. "The court system is slow. They will likely try to claim they are tenants, that you gave them verbal permission to live there. With a pregnant woman involved, a judge might be sympathetic and grant them more time. It could take months." Months. The thought of Brenda and Tiffany living in my mother's house for months, touching her things, sleeping in her room, made me feel physically ill. "Isn't there anything else? Anything faster?" "I'll file the initial paperwork immediately. But I want to review every document you have related to the house. The deed, the will, the insurance policies, everything. Let's see if your mother left us any other ammunition." That afternoon, I brought him a heavy file box from my storage unit. It contained all of Mom's meticulously organized paperwork. As Arthur sifted through the documents, I received the first text from my dad. "Clara, please be reasonable. We can talk about this. Don't do anything rash." It was followed by one from Brenda. "Your father is very disappointed in your selfishness. Tiffany has been stressed all day, and it's not good for the baby. You should be ashamed." I blocked both their numbers without a second thought. My family was the man sitting across from me, a stranger who was fighting for me more than my own father ever had. An hour later, Arthur looked up from a thick document, a curious expression on his face. "This is interesting," he said, holding up the original deed and the records of the house purchase. "Your mother was very specific in the legal structuring." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "The house was purchased using funds from a legal settlement, correct? From the accident?" "Yes," I said quietly. the hospital made a huge error in her post-op care. It was a wrongful death and malpractice settlement. The money was put in a trust, and she used it to buy the house. Exactly, Arthur said, tapping a paragraph on the page. And according to a special clause she had her lawyer add to the deed, the house is irrevocably tied to the source of those funds. It's an unusual provision, almost like a memorial covenant. It states that the property is to be maintained as a sole and primary residence for her direct blood descendants, in honor of the memory and sacrifice of Eleanor Thorne. It further states that any action that desecrates or dishonors that memory could be grounds for, well, it's legally complex, but it gives us a powerful moral, and potentially legal, argument. It was like a voice from the grave. My mother, in her wisdom and foresight, had left me a shield. She knew my father's weaknesses. She must have worried something like this would happen. But here's the part one don't understand, Arthur continued, frowning. I've pulled the public records on the settlement. It was sealed, which is common. But the listed parties are your mother's estate, the hospital, and a third, redacted party. Usually, in a spousal case, your father would be a listed plaintiff. But he's not. His name is nowhere on this. Did he receive a separate settlement? I shook my head. No. He always said he didn't want any of the money. He said it felt wrong. He told me the entire settlement went into the trust for me and Mom. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Something doesn't add up, Clara. Your father voluntarily recusing himself from a multi-million-dollar settlement involving the death of his wife is highly unusual. It's either the act of a saint or the act of a man with something to hide. A cold chill ran down my spine. The story I had always known was that a negligent surgeon had caused a complication, and the hospital had covered it up. It was a simple, tragic story of medical malpractice. But Arthur's words planted a seed of doubt. Why would Dad refuse the money? Why was there a redacted party? I want to petition the court to unseal the full settlement record, Arthur said, his voice firm. I'm going to frame it as necessary due to the desecration clause in your deed. To defend your mother's memory, we need to understand every detail of the sacrifice it was built on. I nodded, my mind racing. I had come here to get my house back. But suddenly, I felt like I was on the verge of uncovering something much deeper, much darker. The fight for my home was becoming a fight for the truth. And I had a sinking feeling that the truth was buried right under the foundation of that house, and my father was the one holding the shovel. The first legal notice was served 2 days later. A stern-faced process server handed the papers to Brenda right on my front porch, next to the tacky pink flamingos. Maya, who had insisted on driving me to witness the moment, cheered from the car. According to her friend who lived across the street, the shouting that erupted from inside the house was loud enough to shake the windows. Their response was predictable and pathetic. I started getting calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Clara, I heard you're trying to evict your poor father and pregnant sister, one aunt chastised. Brenda told me how cruel you're being. Brenda was on a full-scale smear campaign, painting me as a heartless monster who would throw a pregnant woman onto the street. It hurt, but Arthur had warned me. They're trying to isolate you, he'd said. Don't let them. Meanwhile, Arthur was working his own magic. He filed the petition to unseal the settlement records, a brilliant legal maneuver that caught their side completely off guard. Their lawyer, a cheap local attorney Brenda had likely found in the phone book, filed a motion to block it, arguing it was irrelevant to the housing dispute. They're panicking, Arthur told me over the phone, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. They desperately don't want that file opened. Which tells me we're on the right track. While the lawyers battled, I focused on what I could control. I went through the boxes of my mother's things, the ones my family had so thoughtfully packed for me. Tucked away in a photo album, between pictures of my high school graduation and a family vacation, I found a small, worn leather-bound journal. It was my mother's. I had never seen it before. Her handwriting was elegant, but in the final entries, it became shaky, strained. Most of it was about her treatment, her hopes for the future, her love for me. But the last few pages, written in the weeks after the accident but before she bought the house, were different. They were filled with a confusing mix of anger and sadness, all directed at my father. "Robert can't even look at me," she wrote. "He carries his guilt like a shroud. He thinks I don't know, but I see it in his eyes every time he walks into this hospital room. The secret is eating him alive. And she feeds on it. She encourages his silence, tells him it's for the best. But it's not for the best. It's for her. Her. It had to be Brenda. My dad had met Brenda through a grief support group just a few months after the accident, while my mother was still alive, fighting in the hospital. At the time, I thought it was innocent. Now, it felt sinister. What secret was my mother talking about? What did Brenda know? The final entry was just a single, chilling sentence. "The money will not wash the blood away. But perhaps it can build a fortress for my daughter. A place he can never taint with his weakness." I sat on Maya's floor, the journal in my hands, my blood running cold. The story I knew was that Mom's car was T-boned by a red light runner, and her injuries were mishandled at the hospital. But her words. His guilt, his weakness, blood. It didn't sound like the story of a blameless victim. The next day, Arthur called. "Clara, the judge ruled in our favor," he said, his voice taut with excitement. He agreed the memorial covenant was sufficient cause to unseal the records. "I have the file. Can you come to my office?" I was there in 20 minutes. The file was thick. Arthur had it open on his conference table. He looked up at me, his expression grave. "The public story is a lie, Clara. Or at least, a carefully edited version of the truth." "What do you mean?" I whispered. "There was no red light runner," he said, pushing a police report across the table. "It was a single vehicle accident. The car your parents were in swerved off the road and hit a tree. The roads were clear. No adverse weather. The police report cites driver distraction as the probable cause." He then pointed to a deposition summary. "And this is from the hospital settlement. The malpractice claim was real, they did mishandle her internal injuries. But that's not the whole story. The redacted third party in the settlement? It wasn't a person. It was an insurance company." "Whose insurance company?" Arthur took a deep breath before answering. "Your father's, Clara. It was a payout from his auto insurance policy's liability coverage. The hospital's lawyers argued that the severity of the initial crash, caused by your father's distraction, was a major contributing factor to her eventual death. They threatened to countersue him for negligence." I stared at him, my mind unable to process the words. "My dad caused the accident?" "It appears so," Arthur said gently. "The settlement was a complex global agreement. The hospital paid a large sum for the malpractice, and in exchange, your mother's estate agreed not to pursue a wrongful death claim against your father. His name was kept out of the public record to avoid criminal charges and public scandal. He didn't take any of the settlement money because, legally, he was one of the people responsible. It was blood money." Suddenly, my mother's journal entry made perfect, horrifying sense. "The money will not wash the blood away. The secret that was eating him alive." Brenda, who he'd met so soon after, must have known the truth from the beginning. His weakness wasn't just grief, it was guilt. And Brenda had been using it to control him ever since. This entire scheme, stealing my house, my inheritance, it wasn't just greed. It was the culmination of years of manipulation, built on the secret of how my mother truly died. The foundation of my house wasn't just concrete, it was a lie. And it was about to come crashing down. Armed with the truth, I felt a terrifying clarity. The grief for my mother was sharp and new all over again, but it was now mingled with a cold, precise rage. For years, I had believed a sanitized version of my family's tragedy. Now I knew the ugly, unvarnished reality. My father's weakness had set in motion the events that killed her, and Brenda had built her entire life on that weakness. The house wasn't just a home, it was a monument to a lie my father couldn't bear to face. Arthur advised a direct legal assault. We file a new motion, citing this evidence. We can allege he's acting under duress from Brenda, that she's blackmailing him. It will be explosive. No, I said, a plan forming in my mind. This isn't for a courtroom. Not yet. This is for him. I drove to my house. I didn't bring Maya or a lawyer. I needed to do this alone. I walked past the plastic flamingos and banged on my own front door. Tiffany answered, a scowl on her face. What do you want now? Our lawyer told us not to talk to you. I'm not here to talk to you, I said, my voice as cold as ice. I'm here to talk to my father. Alone. Something in my tone must have unnerved her, because she hesitated before shouting, Dad. Clara's here. She's being weird. My father appeared in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his eyes full of a familiar, weary guilt. Brenda was right behind him, her arms crossed, a smug look of authority on her face. Clara, this is not a good time, my dad started. We're going to talk, I said, my gaze locked on him. Not here. On the porch. I turned and walked to the porch swing, my mother's favorite spot, and sat down. I didn't look back to see if he would follow. I knew he would. His guilt was his leash, and I was finally holding it. A moment later, he eased onto the swing beside me, the chains groaning under our combined weight. He wouldn't look at me. Brenda watched us like a hawk from the doorway. I know, I said softly, the two words landing with the force of a physical blow. He flinched. Know what, sweetie? I know there was no red light runner, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. I know it was a single-car accident. I know the police report said driver distraction. I know your insurance paid out. I know the settlement was designed to protect you. Every word struck him like a whip. He began to tremble, his face turning a sickly, pale gray. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with the terrified look of a man whose darkest secret had just been dragged into the light. How? He whispered, his voice cracking. Mom's journal, I lied, deciding to keep Arthur's involvement private for now. And a lot of questions that never made sense. Why did you hate that house? Why couldn't you stand to be in it? Why did you let her? I flicked my eyes toward Brenda, convince you to give away the last piece of Mom I had left. Tears began to stream down his face, the pathetic, silent tears of a broken man. I was on the phone, he choked out, the confession tumbling out of him after years of being suppressed. I was arguing with Brenda. About meeting her. Your mother had found out I was talking to someone from the support group, and she was hurt. She was so hurt and angry. I took my eyes off the road for just a second. Just 1 second, Clara. The confession hung in the air between us, ugly and raw. So that was it. The final, disgusting piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just distracted, he was arguing with his future wife while his current wife sat beside him. She knew, I stated, not a question. He nodded, unable to speak, his body racked with sobs. She told me no one ever had to know. She said it was the hospital's fault anyway. She said it would destroy you to know the truth. That it was our secret, to protect the family. To protect her, I corrected him bitterly. She didn't protect you, Dad. She imprisoned you. She's been holding this over your head for years, hasn't she? Every decision, every time you gave in to her, it was because she had this knife to your back. From the doorway, Brenda's face had gone from smug to horrified. She had heard it all. She strode onto the porch, her face a mask of fury. Robert, stop this nonsense right now. She's manipulating you, she shrieked. But her power was gone. The secret was out, and with it, her hold over him was shattered. He looked up at her, not with fear, but with a dawning, agonizing clarity. He was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time in years. You told me it was for the best, he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and self-loathing. You told me we had to give Tiffany this house because it was what was right for the family. But it was never about the family. It was about you. It was always about you. Tiffany, drawn by the shouting, appeared behind her mother, her face pale with confusion. Mom? What's going on? What is he talking about? Brenda ignored her, her eyes blazing at me. You little witch. You have ruined everything. No, I said, standing up from the swing, feeling a strange sense of calm descend over me. I looked at the three of them, my broken father, the exposed manipulator, and her clueless daughter. You did this to yourselves. You built your entire family on a foundation of lies and secrets. All I did was knock on the door. I turned my back on them and walked away. The shouting continued behind me, a cacophony of accusations, denials, and broken sobs. It was the sound of their world imploding. They had wanted my house so badly. Now, they could have it. It was a tomb, and they were all buried inside. I didn't go back to Maya's. I went to a hotel, turned off my phone, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to grieve. I grieved for my mother in the violent, lonely way she died. I grieved for the father I thought I had, the strong, protective man who turned out to be a weak, guilt-ridden coward. I grieved for the childhood that now felt like a well-told lie. When I woke up the next morning, the grief was still there, but it was overshadowed by a steely, cold resolve. I called Arthur. It's done, I said. He confessed everything. I recounted the entire, ugly scene on the porch. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Clara, he said, his voice heavy with a new kind of respect. You've done more in one conversation than I could have done in 6 months of litigation. They have no leverage. No legal standing. Nothing. Their worst nightmare is no longer a possibility, it's a reality. And he was right. Their nightmare unfolded with breathtaking speed, a direct consequence of their own actions. Nightmare number 1, the humiliation. The first call I received when I turned my phone back on was from my father. His voice was hollow, defeated. Brenda and Tiffany had left. The explosive argument after I left had fractured their family permanently. Brenda, stripped of her blackmail material, had revealed her true, venomous self. Tiffany, finally seeing her mother for the manipulative user she was, had sided with my father, leading to a screaming match that ended with Brenda packing a bag and leaving. The house is yours, Clara, Dad said, his voice devoid of emotion. I'll have mine and Tiffany's things out by the end of the day. The key will be under the mat. Nightmare number 2, the homelessness. They had given up their rental to steal my house. Now, they had neither. My father and a heavily pregnant Tiffany were, quite literally, homeless. They ended up in a dingy, extended-stay motel on the edge of town. Brenda, I later heard, was crashing on a friend's couch. They had schemed to take my sanctuary and in the process, had lost their own. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Nightmare number 3, the financial ruin. Arthur laid out my options with brutal clarity. With his confession, you could launch a wrongful death suit against your father, Clara. Given the circumstances and the original settlement, you would win. It would bankrupt him. You would take everything he has left. The old Clara, the people-pleaser, would have recoiled in horror. But the new Clara, the one forged in betrayal, considered it. I thought about what my mother would want. Justice? Revenge? No. She would want me to be safe. She would want me to be free of them. I arranged one final meeting with my father at the lawyer's office. He looked a decade older, a shell of a man haunted by ghosts of his own making. I'm not going to sue you, I told him, Arthur sitting silently beside me. A flicker of relief crossed his face, but I wasn't finished. But you are going to sign this. Arthur slid a document across the table. It was a legal agreement, a restraining order of sorts, but a voluntary one. It stipulated that he, Brenda, and Tiffany would have no contact with me. It also included a clause that transferred his small savings account, the only asset he had left that Brenda hadn't gotten her hands on, to a trust for his unborn grandchild. It was my one concession to the innocent baby caught in this mess. You will provide for this child, I said. but you will not use it as a weapon or a pawn ever again. He signed it without even reading it. That was his ultimate ruin, not bankruptcy, but the complete and total surrender of his life, dictated by the daughter he had wronged so terribly. My mercy was his final, crushing humiliation. Nightmare number 4, the isolation. The truth, once uncorked, couldn't be put back in the bottle. The story of the blackmail, the house-stealing plot, and the true nature of my mother's death spread through the family like wildfire. Brenda was excommunicated, a pariah. Tiffany was pitted but forever tainted by her mother's greed. And my father became a tragic, lonely figure, a man who had lost 2 families through his own profound weakness. A week later, I stood in my empty, silent house. The cheap live, laugh, love sign was gone, the plastic flamingos were in the trash, and my mother's landscape painting was back in its rightful place. The house felt different. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer secrets. The air was clean. I hired a locksmith, a different one, and stood on the porch as he fitted a new, high-security deadbolt. When he was finished, he handed me a set of shiny, new keys. They felt heavy and cool in my palm. They were not just keys to a house, they were keys to my future, a future I had claimed for myself. My dad, my stepmom, and my stepsister had tried to steal my house. They thought I was a weak girl they could easily discard. But in fighting back, I didn't just reclaim my property. I unearthed the devastating truth that made their worst nightmare come true. They had wanted to take everything from me, and in the end, they were the ones who lost it all. As I slid the new key into the lock and felt the satisfying, solid click, I knew I wasn't just locking my door. I was closing a chapter, and finally, truly, coming home.